Have you ever wondered why we're forced to believe in the technological primitivism of the 19th century, while museum storerooms are bursting with artifacts that cannot be replicated even on modern CNC machines? They've been lying to us our whole lives about the gradual development of progress, drawing a straight line from the stone axe to the smartphone. But that line is fiction. History is not linear. It's cyclical, and we live among the ruins of a civilization that surpassed us in everything, including biomechanics. Today, I want you to open your eyes and look at one of the most inconvenient topics for official science, the topic from which historians avert their gaze and nervously shuffle papers with fake dates. We're talking about the so-called era of prostheses, which, suddenly, as if by a snap of the fingers, arrived in the 1860s. The official version sounds smooth and even heroic. We're told that the Civil War in the United States and the Crimean War in Europe maimed hundreds of thousands of men. Demand creates supply, and voila! Talented, self-taught mechanics supposedly start inventing artificial arms and legs in sheds on their knees. It sounds logical if you're used to believing school textbooks and not asking extra questions. But as soon as you turn on critical thinking for a second and compare the facts, this beautiful picture crumbles to dust. Let's just look at the level of medicine of that time. It's an era when doctors didn't even wash their hands before operations. The concept of antisepsis is only just beginning to break through the wall of academic ignorance. Surgery of the 1860s is a butcher shop, where amputation is performed with a dirty saw in 3 minutes, and the patient most often dies from gangrene or pain shock because proper anesthesia doesn't exist yet. And in this world, where medicine is at the level of medieval barbarism, cyberpunk-level mechanical limbs suddenly appear. Have you seen these prostheses? I'm not talking about Captain Silver's wooden legs or primitive crutches. I'm talking about complex engineering constructions made of brass, steel, leather, and gutta percha, which feature hinged joints imitating human joints with frightening accuracy. Look at the patents from 1863 or 1866. These are not just walking sticks. These are complex exoskeletal structures with spring mechanisms, cable poles, and hydraulics. Yes, you didn't mishear. While official science claims that the peak of technology was steam boilers, we're shown artificial hands with movable fingers capable of holding a pen or a glass, controlled by shoulder or elbow movement. Where from? Where did yesterday's blacksmiths and carpenters get knowledge of biomechanics that we only rediscovered at the end of the 20th century? Ponder the dissonance. On one side, a doctor in a blood-stained frock coat who doesn't know what bacteria are. On the other, an engineer creating a polycentric knee module that allows the amputee not just to hobble, but to walk almost without limping. These are technologies from different eras, from different worlds. It's impossible to create a Mercedes in a world where the wheel hasn't been invented yet. It's impossible to create a high-precision mechanical prosthesis in a world without micro-tools, standardization, and understanding of anatomical mechanics. Unless this knowledge was obtained from outside. Or, even more frighteningly, if these prostheses weren't invented, but adapted. Taken from the warehouses of that very previous civilization, swept away by a wave of oblivion, and passed off as genius inventions of the STEAM era. Let's turn to the numbers, for mathematics is the only language in which it's impossible to lie. Official statistics claim that in the United States alone, after the Civil War, more than 150 patents for improvements in artificial limbs were issued in just 10 years. Explosive growth, a technological leap without analogs. Historians explain this with government support and grants. But can money replace the technological base? If I give you 1,000,000 gold coins in the Stone Age, you won't build a Hadron Collider. To create a hand prosthesis capable of clenching fingers, You need precision lathes, alloys that don't rust from contact with sweat, knowledge of levers that weren't taught in universities of that time. Look at the drawings of the so-called Beaufort hand or James Hanger's prostheses. These are steampunk masterpieces. Inside, a complex system of gears and transmissions. Who machined them? On what machines? Where are the factories that produced these microscopic parts on an industrial scale? We're shown black and white photos of workshops where bearded men with hammers supposedly assemble these technological wonders. But any engineer will tell you that with a hammer and file, it's impossible to achieve such precision fitting of parts. Tolerances down to a few thousandths of an inch are required here. This is the level of Swiss watch manufactories, but multiplied by the strength needed to support the weight of a human body. The mismatch between the level of material processing and the claimed level of industrial development is simply glaring. And here we come to the most terrifying question. Who were these technologies really intended for? Were they truly only for war victims? Or was the war just a smokescreen, a convenient excuse to legalize the appearance on the streets of thousands of people with mechanical body parts? Perhaps these prostheses were not an attempt to help the disabled, but remnants of cyborgization technologies that were commonplace before the mid-19th century catastrophe. Imagine a world where losing a limb wasn't a tragedy because it could be replaced with a mechanism superior to flesh. And then, after some global event that we call the wars of the 19th century, these technologies suddenly resurface. But there's no one left to use them except the unfortunate soldiers ground up by the world's remaking meat grinder. We look at old photographs and see strange people. Their gazes are empty and their poses unnatural. But most importantly, we see a huge number of people with prostheses. Amputation statistics from that time are off the charts. Some reports mention tens of thousands of operations per month. This is an assembly line. This is a factory producing disabled people who are then immediately, right there without leaving the operating table, repaired, using technologies clearly ahead of their time. It creates the impression that someone was deliberately conducting a monstrous experiment on integrating mechanics into the biological body, using the war as cover for mass testing. Let's set aside emotions and turn to dry technical analysis that demolishes the official picture of the world like a house of cards. Take, for example, the famous patent of James Hanger. The story goes that this young man, who lost his leg in the very first battle of the Civil War, while lying in the hospital with nothing to do, fashioned himself a prosthesis from barrel hoops. It sounds like a beautiful legend for a patriotic movie, but any mechanical engineer will tell you it's the ravings of a madman. Hanger's prosthesis, which later became the basis for a giant industry, featured a double-hinged mechanism in the knee and a movable foot. Do you understand what a double hinge is? It's a system that changes the center of rotation depending on the flexion angle, imitating the complex biomechanics of a real bone. Calculating such a trajectory without knowledge of higher mathematics and kinematics is impossible. Manufacturing such parts by hand with a file so they don't jam or have play is impossible. Especially lying on a hospital bed, bleeding and oozing pus. They're trying to sell us a fairy tale about a genius, self-taught inventor to hide the fact that Hanger most likely just found or gained access to a ready-made product whose operating principle he didn't fully understand, but was able to patent. Moving on. Materials. What were these miracle devices made from? Officially, wood, steel, leather. But when we examine museum exhibits, we see strange alloys that haven't corroded in a century and a half. We see the use of vulcanized rubber and gutta percha in nodes that require pressure casting. The vulcanization technology was patented by Goodyear shortly before, But industrial application for such complex shapes required high-precision molds. Where are these molds? Where are the factories that produced them? History is silent. We're shown artisanal workshops, but the products from these workshops look like 21st century factory casting. This is a glaring mismatch between the production base and the final product. It's like finding a microchip in the excavations of ancient Rome and claiming a local blacksmith forged it. Moreover, the weight of the items. Prostheses of that era are remarkably lightweight. To achieve such strength at low weight requires alloyed steels or aluminum. But aluminium at the time cost more than gold. It was obtained chemically in minuscule quantities. The electrolytic method of producing aluminum would only be discovered in the late 1880s. So what are these lightweight frames made of, which we see in old daguerreotypes? Surely not from those materials whose secret was lost along with the antediluvian civilization. Note the complex system of ties and levers in hand prostheses. The so-called Beaufort hand allowed bending fingers individually. This requires micromechanics at the level of watch mechanisms, but capable of withstanding enormous loads. Where are the blueprints for machines capable of cutting such small and durable gears? They don't exist. Yet there are hundreds of patents that appear avalanche-like. In the 1860s, the patent office was literally flooded with applications for mechanical limbs, as if someone opened a warehouse of documentation and began frantically registering rights to what didn't belong to them. This doesn't look like a natural evolutionary process of invention, where one idea slowly flows from another. This looks like the plundering of technological heritage. Imagine you've stumbled upon a warehouse of a forgotten advanced civilization. You don't know how it works, but you see ready-made solutions. You take them, slightly adapt them to the primitive capabilities of your time, replacing broken composite parts with wood and leather, and pass them off as your own invention. That's why many prostheses of that time look like a strange hybrid of futuristic design and primitive materials. This is the cargo cult of the 19th century. Another shocking fact: ergonomics. Creating the prosthetic socket is an art that takes years to master. It must fit the stump perfectly, or the person won't be able to take a single step from the pain. In the mid-19th century, there was no 3D scanning or shape memory polymers. But judging by the records, soldiers put on these prostheses and immediately went back to service or work. This suggests there was some technology for quick fitting or standardization that we're not told about. Or, and this is a terrifying guess, amputations were performed not chaotically, but to strict standards, tailoring living people to the available mechanism sizes. This sounds monstrous, but look at the surgical atlases of that time. Amputation diagrams look like engineering drawings for preparing a blank, as if surgeons knew exactly what would be fitted onto that limb afterward. Medicine and mechanics went hand in hand with frightening synchronicity, impossible for the disjointed disciplines of that era. Now ask yourself, why did this technological surge end so abruptly? By the beginning of the 20th century, progress in prosthetics seemed to freeze. Prostheses from World War I often look more primitive than products from the US Civil War era. Where did the masters go? Where did the technologies disappear? Why did we revert to wooden legs and hooks, and only by the end of the 20th century begin approaching the functionality of those very Victorian cyborgs? The answer is simple and terrifying. The stock of found technologies ran out. The warehouses were emptied, complex mechanisms broke down, and there was no one to repair them because their creators had vanished long before. We used someone else's heritage until it crumbled to dust, and we had to start from scratch. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. If they could replace arms and legs, what else could they replace? And who really populated the cities after the mid-19th century catastrophe? Now we will plunge into the thick of the technical contradictions that make your hair stand on end. Let's take a specific example, considered the gold standard of prosthetics from that era, the so-called Palmer leg. Benjamin Palmer patented his invention back in the 1840s, but it gained mass, I would even say industrial distribution, precisely in the 1860s during the Civil War. On paper, everything looks smooth. A talented inventor came up with a system of springs and tendons. But let's look inside this construction. Inside the Palmer leg was a complex imitation of human muscles. The flexors and extensors were played by bundles of catgut, specially processed animal intestines. Primitive material, one might think? Not at all. These bundles were secured in such a way that they provided non-linear tension. That is, the more the leg bent, the more the muscle resisted, precisely replicating the biomechanics of living tissue. Do you understand that calculating such a system of differential equations, describing the elasticity of biological materials, requires years of laboratory research? In the 19th century, there were no instruments capable of measuring dynamic stress in a moving muscle with such precision. Where did Palmer get these coefficients? How did he know how organics would behave in tandem with metal and wood after a year of use? The official version is silent. But there's an even more frightening detail: durability. Catgut is organic. In conditions of humidity, sweat, and temperature fluctuations, it should rot and lose elasticity in mere weeks. However, surviving specimens that have lain in museums for a century and a half demonstrate remarkable preservation of the internal elements. This suggests that either the material underwent some chemical treatment whose secret is lost, or deliberately hidden, or it wasn't ordinary catgut at all, but some polymeric composite from that previous civilization, which externally resembles organics but has the properties of eternal plastic. Moving on, look at the European analogues from the same period. We see hand prostheses in which wrist rotation is implemented. Ponder for a second. Wrist rotation of 360 degrees, or at least 180, is a complex engineering task requiring rolling bearings. Officially, the ball bearing of the modern type was patented only at the very end of the 19th century and began to be widely used in bicycles. But we find rotating assemblies in 1860s prostheses that operate smoothly, without play or jamming. Who made them? If you try to turn a perfect ball from hardened steel by hand, it will take you weeks for one ball, and it still won't be perfect. Yet here we see serial production. Thousands of assemblies. This means only one thing. Automatic lines were operating somewhere. Workshops with equipment capable of producing standardized parts in million-unit runs stood somewhere. And this equipment was destroyed or hidden immediately after the order for cyborgs was fulfilled. Another impossible fact is patient survival rates. Let's be realistic. Thigh amputation in the mid-19th century was a death sentence in 90% of cases. Shock, blood loss, sepsis. Even if the soldier survived, the stump was a scarred mess, extremely sensitive to pressure. Putting a rigid wooden or metal corset on such a leg and transferring body weight onto it was hellish torment. Modern medicine uses silicone liners, gel pads, vacuum suspension to distribute the load. In the 19th century, as we're told, the stump was simply wrapped in a woolen sock and inserted into a rigid socket. Any orthopedist will tell you that after an hour of walking, the skin will chafe to blood. After a day, unhealing ulcers will form, and after a week, necrosis will begin. But historical chronicles are full of mentions of veterans who not only walked, but worked in the fields, danced at balls, and led active lives immediately after receiving the prosthesis. This is biologically impossible without pain suppression technologies or perfect interface compatibility technologies, of which we have no knowledge. Here, an analogy with 18th century automata suggests itself. Remember the famous mechanical dolls of Jacques Dreux? The writer, the draftsman, the musician. These robots, supposedly created in the 1770s, possess such movement kinematics that are hard to replicate even today. They breathe, their eyes move, their fingers press keys with varying force. Official history calls them toys of geniuses. But what if these dolls are not toys, but surviving samples of biomechanical bodies from that very era when prostheses were the norm? What if the prostheses of the 1860s were an attempt to recycle the remnants of similar but larger and more functional mechanisms? Imagine an android graveyard unearthed by enterprising 19th century businessmen. They tear off arms and legs from broken machines, slightly adapt the mounts, and sell them to living people. This explains why the mechanisms inside the prostheses often look more complex and advanced than their outer shell. Inside, gears from unknown alloys. Outside, coarse leather and rivets made by a local cobbler. And finally, the scale. After the Civil War in the United States, the government launched a program to provide veterans with prostheses. We're talking about tens of thousands of items. Imagine the logistics. Take measurements, send to the factory, manufacture, ship back, fit. Without phones, internet, or fast mail, with the South's railroads destroyed, this should have taken decades. But according to documents, the process went swiftly, as if warehouses were already stocked with ready-made products in various sizes, as if someone knew in advance how many arms and legs would need to be amputated and had prepared spare parts in advance. This is the most frightening part. The war looks not like a political conflict, but like a gigantic harvest operation, bringing the population into line with the available inventory of spare parts. We shouldn't forget the so-called cosmetic prostheses of that time either. Museums hold hands covered with a material imitating human skin with frightening detail. Veins, wrinkles, nails. This material has darkened and cracked over time, but chemical analysis shows the presence of complex polymers. In the 19th century, polymer chemistry was in its infancy. Where did the technology for creating artificial skin come from, which felt like the real thing to the touch? This is the level of late 20th century Hollywood special effects. We're told it's papier-mâché and wax, but wax melts in the sun, and papier-mâché gets soggy in the rain. These items have survived a century and a half. This is yet more proof that we're dealing with antediluvian world technologies that were used parasitically. We are a scavenger civilization that donned the remnants of the gods' clothing and fancied ourselves great inventors. And now ask yourself, if prosthetics was at such a level, why didn't it go further? Why didn't we see exoskeletons in 1900? Why didn't mechanical organs, hearts, lungs appear? Most likely they existed. They were just suppressed even more harshly. Limb prostheses were left because they were too noticeable and needed for the workforce, while life extension and internal organ enhancement technologies went underground, becoming the privilege of that elite which staged this global spectacle. Now that we've realized the technical impossibility of such prostheses existing under official primitivism, let's go up a level and look at those who wore these mechanisms. Look at the faces of people in photographs from the second half of the 19th century. Doesn't it give you the creeps? This isn't just the effect of long exposure or poor emulsion. This is the uncanny valley effect. We see thousands, Millions of practically identical men in the same clothes, with the same haircuts and empty, as if erased eyes. Official demography claims that the 19th century was a time of unprecedented birth rate explosion. They're trying to convince us that, despite monstrous unsanitary conditions, lack of antibiotics, constant cholera and typhoid epidemics, and endless bloody wars, urban populations grew in geometric progression. The math here doesn't just limp, it screams of falsification. Let's turn on logic. War destroys the reproductive male population. Diseases mow down children. Under such conditions, population should decline or stagnate. But we're shown graphs shooting vertically upward precisely from the 1860s. Where did these millions of adult, able-bodied people come from? Historians mumble mantras about urbanization and immigration. But moving from village to city doesn't create new people. It just relocates them. And migration? Where did these hordes sail from if wars were raging in Europe too? It creates the impression that these crowds of people simply appeared in ready-made form. They emerged from nowhere, filling the ghost cities emptied by the catastrophe, ready to work in factories, ready to live in basements, and most importantly, ready to obey without complaint. And here the theory of the prosthesis era takes on an utterly sinister hue. What if these mechanical limbs were intended not for war heroes, but for defective specimens of this new, artificially bred population? Imagine a scenario of global reboot. The previous highly advanced civilization was destroyed by a cataclysm, that very one that buried the first floors of buildings worldwide in clay and silt. The earth is empty. But the masters, those who survived in bunkers or came from outside, needed a workforce to excavate the ruins, restart the surviving factories, and restore the infrastructure. Restoring the population naturally would take too long. A quick solution was needed. Incubators, cloning, bioprinting. Call it what you will, the essence is the same. Mass production of biological bodies. But any assembly line has failures. Accelerated growth or genetic intervention leads to defects. Weak bones, underdeveloped limbs, genetic breakdowns. That's where this flood of amputations and prosthetics came from. People weren't healed, they were upgraded with parts. Bodies that couldn't withstand the loads were repaired using technologies left over from the gods of the past. A prosthesis in the 19th century was not an act of humanism. It was technical maintenance of a biological tool. That's why we see such standardization. That's why surgical operations resemble machinists fitting. Man ceased to be a creation of God. He became a unit, expendable material to which a brass arm could be bolted if the native one fell off or didn't grow properly. This explains humanity's strange amnesia, too. Why do we know nothing about our great-great-grandfathers? For most people, the family tree cuts off right in the mid or late 19th century. Beyond that, darkness. No family legends, no diaries describing life before the reboot. Because there was no one to remember. These new people who populated Paris, London, St. Petersburg, and New York had no past. They had only implanted memory or a clean slate. They awoke in a world they didn't build, donned clothes they didn't sew, and went to work on machines whose operating principles only a few overseers understood. They were ideal slaves, unremembering of freedom, ignorant of the truth, ready to accept any lie written in the morning newspapers. We look at the disabled of that era with pity, but perhaps we should look with horror. These people with mechanical arms and legs were the first cyborgs, living proof that our species was modified. We are descendants not of great conquerors, but of survivors in a genetic experiment. The wars of the 19th century were not conflicts of nations, but a cleansing of territory and disposal of those who remembered the old world, or culling of failed batches of the new population. The mud, blood, and roar of cannons concealed the process of replacing a civilization. The old, gigantic, harmonious race departed, leaving behind majestic cathedrals and star fortresses. In its place came we, small, weak, short-lived, needing crutches and prostheses just to exist in this world of giants. Emotionally, this is hard to accept. We want to believe in progress, in evolution, but the facts hit like a slap in the face. The explosive growth of prosthetics technology, which cannot be explained by the level of science of that time, correlates with demographic anomalies and oddities in architecture and logistics. These are links in one chain, the chain that shackled us to this distorted reality. We live in the scenery of someone else's spectacle, and our bodies bear the stamp of this substitution. Those very amputation scars that were on every third veteran, these are the scars of the birth of our new world. A world built on bones and metal. But the most important thing is hidden in what all this led to. Where did the technologies go? Why did the masters shut down the Cyborgization program and let us degrade to wooden crutches in the 20th century? Because the task was completed. The ruins were excavated, the cities populated, the new history written and hammered into heads through schools. Complex prostheses became unnecessary. They were too obvious a reminder of the high technological past. They were confiscated, hidden in museums, called curiosities, and we were left with primitive medicine and faith that we are the crown of creation. The prosthesis era of the 1860s was a desperate attempt by the puppeteers who seized control of the planet to maintain the functionality of the biological resource, you and me. They didn't need happy people. They needed work units capable of holding a shovel and standing at a machine. And when the human resource started running short, when bodies began to fail under the onslaught of the altered atmosphere and new viruses, they opened their storerooms and issued us crutches. Not those wooden sticks drawn in textbooks, but high-tech exoskeletons that we naively took for the genius of human thought. Ponder phantom pains. Medicine says it's nerve endings sending false signals to the brain. But what if it's not physiology? What if it's genetic memory? Memory of the time when we were different, when our bodies were more perfect, stronger, possibly already partially mechanized at the DNA level. We feel the pain of lost opportunities, of that great civilization we are heirs to, but which was stolen from us, substituting in its place a school history textbook with pictures of bearded men with stone axes. We are a civilization of amputees. They didn't cut off our arms and legs. They cut off our memory, our pride, and our true knowledge of our origins. And prostheses are merely a symbol of our dependence on those who dole out technologies to us in portions, like feeding domestic animals.